Hey everyone, welcome back to your Resident Evil channel. Alright guys, today I'm doing a recap of all the Spider-Man movies, especially just so you guys can understand what's going on in No Way Home, like the new Spider-Man that's coming out. I'm so excited! I'm gonna go watch it December 16th at 10:30 Eastern time, so please, if you see it before me, don't spoil anything until after that time for me. So essentially, December 17th. Spoil it all for me. Okay. I'm not just going to be recapping the MCU Spider-Man. I'm going to be recapping all the Spider-Mans just because there are possibilities that Holland may be rolling up. And we already know some villains from like the other Spider-Mans that are confirmed to be returning to the MCU that are going to be making cameos. So let's start off with recapping all the MCUs because I think at this point most of you are familiar with the Spider-Man MCU more than probably the other ones, and I think that'll just be easier to go to. Alright, so as you know, Spider-Man comes in at Civil War. He's kind of recruited, no, he is recruited by Iron Man. He fights Captain America. He's just like this nerdy kid. It's our first introduction to Tom Holland's Spider-Man. It's debatable whether or not you like it. But let's move on. Then we get Homecoming, where he's a kind of already an established superhero at this point. We don't see that origin story that we've seen with the other two Spider-Mans, with Tom Holland Spider-Man. He's just going to high school. He's going to this homecoming dance. He really wants to be an Avenger. He keeps contacting Iron Man after he's kind of dealt with Civil War, and he's like, I want to be an Avenger. He kind of goes a little like on his own, does his own stuff. Like Iron Man reprimands him for like not being safe, not being careful. So he's like, you can't be an Avenger anymore. To give me back the suit, because like Iron Man gives him a suit. He gives him back the suit. Anyways, it's kind of like his becoming of a hero story, not his origin story, just him embracing what it truly means to be a hero. We also find out in this movie that Zendaya's MJ because she goes by another name in this movie. It's like revealed at the end. Then now the more thing to remember about, in my opinion, about this MCU storyline is the fact that he's crushing on the girl named Liz, and her dad is the main villain of the story in this movie. And at the end, like, Liz goes away, like it's not important, but he's in jail. So when I ask him, do you know the secret identity of Spider-Man, which he does, he figures out who that is, Peter Parker. He doesn't reveal it, but he may make a cameo. I think he did, they've already established this, that he may make a cameo in the new one. So just remember his, like, he's just mostly just so you remember who he is. All right, then we have Infinity War. There's that huge war where people are disappearing. That's when Tom Holland's like, he says like, I don't want to go, Mr. Stark. And like Stark, who's like emotionally wrecked by his death, and later in Endgame he also dies, spoilers. And so then like Tom Holland sees Iron Man die. This is very important to the rest of the story. It's not just something that I'm just throwing in there. Also in Infinity War he becomes an official Avenger, because so in Homecoming, Tony's like, hey, do you want to, like, you've proved yourself to be this great hero, now you get to be an Avenger. And then Tom was like, nah, I'm good. But then in Infinity War he does become a full-fledged Avenger, and that's again important for the next movie, which is Far From Home. So pretty much in this movie, he's mourning Tony's death. If you ask me, this is when, in my eyes, Tom Holland truly becomes Spider-Man. This is a much better story and like really built him up to be this a really amazing Spider-Man than anything before that. Like, I didn't understand why everyone was freaking out over his death. Not gonna lie, in Infinity War, I'm like, okay, like, okay. But hey, but that's just my personal opinion, so. And I can delve into that more if you guys want. Okay. Anyway, so he's mourning Tony's death. He wants to just be like, the main thing is in this movie, he really wants to be just to be this regular kid. He has a crush on MJ, and he wants to profess his crush to her, like become her boyfriend, and that's kind of important for like later again. Anyways, during this time, Nick Fury, who's just wants to reach out to him, he's like, hey, I need to talk to you. You need to come. Like, we have a lot of Avengers down. You're the only one that's kind of do all this. And he's like, no, I'm taking a break. I'm doing this. Anyways, Nick Fury eventually contacts him. They find out there's like this huge like fight going on in Prague. Anyways, during his school trip, he meets this guy named Beck. Nick Fury gives him like Iron Man's glasses, which he gets like it's Edith's intelligence, which is kind of like vision. Anyways, so he's overwhelmed by the new responsibilities that he has. He's like, can I do this? Can I truly do this? Anyways, when he meets Beck, this like new superhero, quote unquote, but turns out to be the villain of the story. Oh no. He gives him like Iron Man's glasses. Now he has even more power, and then eventually like he he finally understands that he has to be Spider-Man, that he needs to take responsibility, and that he needs to step up. He ends up defeating Beck, even though, like, at the end was really cool. Like, there's a moment where Beck's, like, pretends to be a good guy, and then Spider-Man's like, no, he gets back his, like, Spidey sense. Anyways, that's pretty much, like, the whole roundabout. He's no longer fooled by him. That's pretty much it. He embraces being Spider-Man. Anyways, he goes back to New York. He's with Zendaya. Zendaya finds out that he's actually Spider-Man. I'm sorry, MJ finds out that he's actually Spider-Man. They're together, they're going, and all of a sudden, right at the end, Beck reveals that he comes on the Times Square and he's like, Spider-Man is Peter Parker, and then everyone knows, and that's where No Way Home's gonna start. Pretty much everyone knows, people are kind of hating on him, you know, and they know his secret identity, and that's where we leave off. Alright, now for the Amazing Spider-Man recaps. Alright, so the first one, we start off with Peter just being this nerdy guy. He gets beaten up at school, like one of the first things, a pretty graphic beat up, to be honest. Like, I think the Amazing Spider-Man are definitely the more graphic of all the Spider-Mans, for sure. Anyways, he's kind of a little bit in his rebellious stage. He's not always into his aunt and uncle. Anyways, we also learn more about his parents in general, which is something we've never really learned about Spider-Man and his parents and his history. We learned that his dad used to work with Dr. Connors, who is this huge, like, big scientist. Anyways, he wants to meet Dr. Connors to learn more about his parents, kind of what happened and everything like that. So then he sneaks into Dr. Connors' lab, where he meets, well, not meets, but like where his relationship with Gwen kind of grows a little bit more as well, which is a love interest in this case. Dr. Connors and him, they kind of have like this mentee-mentor type of relationship. They start growing off, and he starts learning more about his dad. Anyways, during his break into the lab, he gets bitten by a radioactive spider, and then of course he becomes Spider-Man, and then of course he's being even more rebellious, not listening to Uncle Ben, and just getting upset at them for not like telling him more about his dad. He leaves his house for a minute. His uncle goes chasing after him, and during that time he decides to like, he really wants milk, but he can't afford the milk. There's a thief in the store who's like stealing beer and ends up throwing him the milk, and then Spider-Man's like, oh, Peter Parker is like, okay, great, and then he gets the milk and then lets the thief go after the guy's like, oh, why didn't you chase him? And he's like, but why? And then his uncle comes in, wrong place, wrong times, tries to do the noble thing, and it's just very important to the story of how he becomes Spider-Man, because he feels guilty, and then he's mourning his uncle's death, he's growing his relationship with Gwen. Anyways, during that time, he's talking to Dr. Connors and just like mourning his uncle's death and everything, he reveals to him the secret formula of how to like extend life or just regenerate, just like, you know, fix your illnesses, because Norman Osborn is pressuring Dr. Connors to come up with a solution to his lifelong disease. That's like his terminally ill disease. Anyways, Dr. Connors experiments on himself. It goes horribly wrong. He turns into this huge giant lizard that's terrorizing the city, because it also affects his mental state as well, which is very much like the 2004 Spider-Man, but I digress. Like the plot. Anyways, him and Gwen get together. He ends up Peter tells Gwen like, oh, I'm Spider-Man. Gwen's like, oh no, I'm in trouble. Which, talk about foreshadowing. Her dad, who's a police officer, does not like Peter, does not like Spider-Man at all. So he is not necessarily for this relationship for them. And so he eventually finds out that Peter is Spider-Man. It tells him, stay away from Gwen, like when he's literally on his deathbed after they defeat Professor Connors. And then he's like, okay, I will. And then we start with Amazing Spider-Man 2. Gwen's like, you didn't have to break up with me, but you know, we're fine. We're broken up because my dad made you promise, blah, blah, blah. They have this very dramatic thing. Eventually they get back together, which is pretty much her ultimate demise. And during this time, Harry Osborn, who is, again, from like the first... Harry Osborn, who is the son of Norman Osborn, rekindles his friendship with Peter, tells him about his father's terminally illness death, and his father dies in this movie, and then his father tells him, you also have my illness, like, you need to find a cure, if not, you're going to die as well. And he reaches out to Peter, who's taking pictures of Spider-Man for the Bugle, of course, and then he's like, yo, like, I need to talk to Spider-Man so he can give me, like, the cure of, like, so I can ideally, this will help me for my disease. Spider-Man was like, I don't want something that happened to Dr. Connors to happen to him, doesn't want to do that, doesn't want to give him the solution. Eventually, Harry finds out who Spider-Man is. Also, we have this villain. Okay, so, this was interesting. The villain who becomes Rhino is, like, starts off the movie with, he's like still he's doing other like horrible things. He'll become Rhino in the future. He ends up about to like kill like future Electro. Spider-Man saves future Electro, and then Electro becomes Electro, becoming the main villain of the story. Electro and Green Goblin join together to destroy Spider-Man. And then and then Green Goblin ends up killing Gwen, and then Green Goblin ends up going to jail, and then Green Goblin meets future Rhino, turns him into Rhino, and during this time while Green Goblin is in jail, Spider-Man, after the death of Gwen, is like, I will no longer be Spider-Man, I can't keep doing this anymore, hurting people, blah, blah, blah. Eventually, he hears Gwen's, like, graduation, because at this time, like, they've had their graduation now, and then he hears the speech, and then he's like, oh my gosh, I have to go back and become Spider-Man, and then Rhino is terrorizing the city, so pretty much it's, like, all full circle, and that's where the movie ends. He's literally about to fight Rhino, the villain. So that's pretty much it with The Amazing Spider-Man. I think everyone's alluding to the fact that with Gwen's death and, like, that image of MJ falling, like, perhaps Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man is going to rescue MJ, so that's pretty much what's going on in The Amazing Spider-Man series, and what's like the most important thing. Now, in my opinion, we're actually not going to talk a lot about The Amazing Spider-Man in the new movie. We're actually going to focus more on the original Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. All right. So for the first movie, this is by far one of the best, best superhero entrances we have ever had, like superhero origins that we have ever had on this big screen. And that's 100% biased. All right, so we have Peter Parker, who's this very nerdy, geeky guy. He goes to high school with his best friend, Harry. They're both kind of a little bit of outcasts, it seems, in high school. He has a huge crush on his neighbor, Mary Jane. He's, like, been in love with her forever, tries to get just everything to get her attention. Eventually, they're going to, like, on a tour of this, like, they're going on a tour of this university, I believe. And there's a spider that bites Peter. Peter ends up becoming Spider-Man after this, and then he's learning to, like, use his powers and everything, and then, of course, like, his Uncle Ben and Aunt May are, like, he's acting weird, so then Uncle Ben's like, where he's going through changes, so I have to talk to him, and so Uncle Ben talks to him, and he's like, with great power comes great responsibility, speech. At that time, he's a teenager, he's like, leave me alone, and in an effort to try to win Mary Jane, he ends up going to, like, this boxing, like, cage fight. It's not a boxing match, it's a cage fight where he tries to win money so he can buy a car. Anyways, they end up, like, stiffing him. They're like, oh, well, you didn't last as long, even though you defeated the guy, you didn't last the full, like, round, so we're only gonna give you, like, I think it was like $100 or something. And then he gets mad, and then a thief comes in there, takes all the money, and then the guy who, like, tried to, like, just, like, stiff him, essentially, he's like, oh, go after him, and he's like, no, why should I? And then that guy turns out to have, and then by letting him go and not doing the right thing, he ends up going and killing his Uncle Ben. Peter feels so guilty. He's like, I am the reason my uncle is dead. And then he's hiding this from his aunt. Like, you feel how, like, morally, like, conflicted he is at this moment. Anyways, he goes to his graduation, and then he's trying to find a new, like, father figure, which sort of Norman Osborn takes that father figure for a minute, because he's just like, I'm so sorry for your uncle's death. And he's just become this kind of, like, other fatherly figure, which is really cool. Which sucks for Harry, because his father does not appreciate him, and so they have like, this thing where, like, oh, he appreciates Peter but not me. So then Harry goes after, like, the girl of Peter's dreams, ends up dating Mary Jane, which is just shady as crap. And weirdly enough, Peter has no idea that they're dating, even though they end up living together. Like, him and Harry end up living together after college, after high school graduation. They end up living in the city together, and he's kept the new girl, like, so secret. And Mary Jane one day tells him, like, yeah, me and Harry, we're dating, and he's like, what? Which sucks for him. He ends up starts working for the Bugle, where the Bugle is, like, bad-mouthing Spider-Man, and he's taking the pictures that people are bad-mouthing him. They call him this vigilante. The city, like, doesn't know whether to like or believe in Spider-Man, and so they're just kind of, like, on this whole thing. Anyways, Norman Osborn finds out that that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and Norman Osborn at this point has become the Green Goblin, and he's like, I have to defeat Spider-Man, and then he ends up at first trying to get Spider-Man to join him. Spider-Man's like, no, and then the Green Goblin kidnaps Mary Jane because because Harry tells him that Peter Parker has loved Mary Jane his whole life, and then the Green Goblin kidnaps Mary Jane, holds her as hostages with a bunch of kids, and then Peter ends up saving both the kids and Mary Jane, unlike the Amazing Spider-Man could. He ends up saving all of them, but then they end up fighting, and he's like, he thinks that, and then he's like tries to manipulate Peter. He's like, Peter, save me from the Green Goblin, and then Peter ends up accidentally killing the Green Goblin as well. So not only he has essentially killed two father figures in the span of one movie. Also, the pace is amazing for this movie. Like, this movie, I should just do a whole movie review for this movie. But anyways, pretty much that's what's going on. At the end of it, they're going to the funeral of Norman Osborn. Harry is upset because he finds out that Spider-Man killed him. He doesn't know who Spider-Man is yet, but he's like, Spider-Man killed my father, so now I have to avenge my father. And then he's like, and he tried to tell Peter, you take pictures of Spider-Man, so you know who Spider-Man is. So you must tell me. And then, like, he just walks away. And then MJ, like, goes to Peter, and she's like, I realize that you're the one that I want to be with during this funeral. And then he walks away. He's like, MJ, you and I, we can't be together. And then he walks away saying, because with great power comes great responsibility. And boom! Such a great movie ending. Anyways, we get the second Spider-Man. Also, he's in college now. He's in Professor Connor's class, which is interesting because he becomes a lizard, and he also doesn't have an arm in the movies, and like they're hinting at a possible movie with Professor Connors, which never happened because the third Spider-Man was so horrible. Like, that's just my prediction. But it was just really cool that they were just dropping little like hints like that all over since like the second movie. Anyways, he's in Professor Connors' class in this case, and you know, he's just lacking. Like, he's not being the best Spider-Man, he's not being the best college student, he's not being the best nephew. Like, everything we get, he's just being pulled in every direction. So he's like, I need to take a break. The girl of his dreams is engaged to this astronaut. He meets Doc Ock, who is like building this like huge like sun. He's building like a mini sun essentially, and then by building this like mini, he also starts becoming like a mentor for Peter, also kind of like a father figure for Peter. They meet, they gel so well, but then when he builds a mini sun, he ends up becoming Dr. Octopus, and then he's just like terrorizing the city. Peter decides to take a break from being Spider-Man. He's like, I can't handle it. Why can't I just focus on myself? Why can't I just do the things that I really want to do? His Aunt May kind of talks him, like, without actually talking to him. He's like, you know, we all miss Spider-Man because, also Spider-Man saves Aunt May, because at first Aunt May didn't like Spider-Man because he killed the Green, like, Harry Osborn, because they didn't know he was the Green Goblin. And then he's like, I didn't like Spider-Man. And then because Spider-Man does save her, she's like, maybe I was wrong about Spider-Man. And then she makes a speech like, we all miss Spider-Man. He was defending the city. Like, the crime rates were down. Where is Spider-Man? Where did he go? And the speech that he gives her pretty much motivates Peter to become Spider-Man again. Also, what's interesting, he actually tells Aunt May that he is responsible for his uncle's death. And so it's so well done. Like, that scene, those moments, so good. But Aunt May, like, of course, forgives him because she knows, like, it wasn't truly his fault, which helps soothe all, like, this, like, stress and just pressure and more just things that are, like, holding him back, essentially, which makes him become Spider-Man again. He defends Dr. Octopus, and of course, that was, like, one of the things that makes him go back to being Spider-Man, because, of course, Dr. Octopus, because Harry Osborn tells him, because it's a tritium. So he's like, I need to build the sun again. Okay, so that's why he becomes Dr. Octopus. He's like, I don't need to build the sun again. That's my main mission of this movie. And then Harry is like, if you want to become Dr. Octopus, like, if you want to, like, build this, like, sun again, you need to bring me Spider-Man. And he's like, how do I bring you Spider-Man? Peter Parker takes pictures of Spider-Man, so he'll know how to get in contact with Spider-Man. And so, pretty much, Dr. Octopus sees, like, Peter Parker and Mary Jane together one day at a cafe, where she's like, should I leave? Like, she's like, I want to be with you, Peter. And then he's like, we can't be together, because he's about to decide that pretty much he's going to be Spider-Man again. And then the Dr. Octopus kidnaps Mary Jane. He's like, if you don't bring me Spider-Man, Peter Parker, then I'm going to kill Mary Jane. So he kidnaps Mary Jane. Peter Parker... so then Peter changes into Spider-Man suit, fights Dr. Octopus. Dr. Octopus brings Peter Parker to Harry. Harry then is about to kill Spider-Man, but then when he reveals his mask, it's Peter Parker. He's like, it's my friend, my brother. Oh my gosh, I can't kill you. And then he's like, where is Dr. Octopus? And then he finds out he's trying to build a sun again. So then he's like, I have to go. He goes, rescues Mary Jane, wakes up Dr. Octopus and tells him, this isn't what you're supposed to. You told me that science, we have a responsibility to do good for mankind. This isn't doing good. And then he's like, you're right. And then Dr. Octopus ends up dying, bringing down the makeshift sun with him. Also, in this, it's a very small detail. He meets this one kid that he's like, how did you do that? To Tom Holland. And I hope that that's Miles Morales. Okay, Spider-Man 3. There's an insane amount of things that happen in Spider-Man 3 that you're just like, okay. So we have Peter who's about to propose to Mary Jane. Mary Jane, like, is, like, conflicted with so many things, decides not to, like, she pushes Spider-Man away, so they're like on the rocks during this time. An asteroid type of thing hits the Earth, which contains like the species for Venom. Venom during this time is like in the background following Spider-Man. Also, and then right around the time when like things starts going south for Spider-Man, even though in the beginning of the movie we find out that everyone's in love with Spider-Man, everyone thinks like pray to Spider-Man, he's just like, oh no, like things just start falling apart. We see that Harry wants to avenge his father's death, so he gets into like a fist fight with Peter. And during this fist fight, Peter knocks Harry into the ground, which makes him lose amnesia, which makes him forget that Peter killed Spider-Man, that Spider-Man killed his dad. So everything is going great. He becomes friends with Mary Jane again, and they're like, Harry and Mary Jane are very close until eventually he recovers his memory, and then he's like, he kind of blackmails her. He's like, you need to break up with Peter, and so she does. So then like Peter's like, oh no, like, so then like that's one more step closer to his like temporary insanity, because then he ends up, then later on we find out that through Gwen's father, because yes, Gwen makes an appearance, Gwen's father, who is also in the police again, and also in this movie, he's like, oh, by the way, Uncle Ben wasn't killed by the original guy, so technically it wasn't all like Spider-Man's fault. It was actually killed by the Sandman who has a daughter who's actually trying to do a noble thing, accidentally, and it haunts him that he accidentally killed Uncle Ben, but we don't know that just yet. But anyways, he accidentally kills Uncle Ben, and he's haunted by this, and he does it all for his daughter. During this time, Spider-Man's like now enraged by this, gets possessed by Venom, and he ends up fighting the Sandman while he's possessed by Venom. He makes MJ jealous by dancing with Gwen, which is just so lame. And then his rival photographer, who was Eddie Brock, took fake pictures of Spider-Man doing evil things, but then like he tells J. Jonah Jameson, who is the editor of the Daily Bugle, is like, hey, those are fake pictures. So then he ends up taking Eddie Brock's like spot, and then Eddie Brock's upset. And then during this time, he with everything going on, and after everything, he's like, I have done so many horrible things, being kind of possessed by Venom. So then he goes to like this bell tower, which he notices that the sound like affects this mutant monster that he's being possessed with. And so as he's getting rid of this mutant monster, the mutant monster takes hold of Eddie Brock. Eddie Brock is now Venom. Pretty much after all this, like, Brock and the Sandman join forces to try to destroy Spider-Man. And then during this time, and they also at some point kidnap Mary Jane. Then again, she gets kidnapped like every movie. And then during this time, like, Peter's like talks to the Green Goblin, and they have like a second fight also during the Green Goblin when like Harry recovers, and then he's like, you need to help me. And then Harry also finds out that true story of how like his father died, that his father didn't actually was killed by Peter Parker, by like Spider-Man. It was kind of like an accident. It was the glider that ended up killing him, and just his evilness. The butler ends up telling him all of this. So then he ends up going to help Peter Parker. He's like, okay, fine, I'll help you save MJ. He says, as he's helping him save MJ, he's actually killed the same way his father is in the first movie. And then Peter and MJ get back together. That's essentially the ending of it. I don't think, honestly, that the third Spider-Man movie will have any game to play in the new No Way From Home, but definitely something to note. A lot happens in Spider-Man 3. But yes, so that is the full recap of all the Spider-Mans. Yeah. Alright, guys, let me know if there's any other videos you want me to do, and bye!